Hurricane Charlotte did not creep across the Pacific like the storms the meteorologists studied in neat satellite loops. She roared in on a clawing wind, chewing 40-foot walls of water into jagged white teeth that hammered the USS Independence. From every side, the carrier 98,000 tons of steel and willpower lurched on each swell, its vast flight deck tilting and groaning as though trying to shake the squall off its back. Above that deck, shivering in grey daylight that looked more like dusk, 5 FA-18 Super Hornets clawed for altitude, engines howling against the gale. Inside the lead jet, Carlson Phoenix lead, Lieutenant Commander Gabe Morales felt his flight controls twitch as either a downdraft or an underwing vortex tried to spin him. Rain slammed the canopy so hard it sounded like gravel. He flicked his mic. Independence. This is Phoenix-led fuel, critical, visibility 0, requesting emergency vectors for recovery. Static tumbled through the channel, followed by the strained voice of Air Boss Kim Wells. Copy, Phoenix lead. We're working solutions. Hold pattern to miles astern. Hold pattern. Morales bit back a curse. They'd already been circling 27 minutes longer than planned because Charlotte's eye had jogged north, wrecking every flight deck timeline. On the best day, an FA-18 carried maybe 20 minutes of loiter fuel. Once the reserve light blinked, his reserve light now glared blood red. So did those of the 4 wingmen scattered like frightened sparrows around him, ghostly silhouettes appearing and vanishing within sheets of water. Down on deck, crew in color-coded jerseys staggered through gusts topping 90 knots, securing loose equipment, dogging hatches. A few family day guests, VIPs here to watch. Routine. Carrier ops before the ship's next deployment huddled along the catwalk rail, eyes wide as loose lines cracked overhead. Among them was a stooped, silver-haired man in an old navy peacoat several sizes too big. He gripped an oiled wood walking stick the way some men grip sabers and stood just outside the red danger line, apparently unbothered that the deck under his boots pitched like a carnival ride. His name tags temporary paper, laminated and flapping, read, Eli Harrison. Ship's manifest said he was the late Vice Admiral Daniel Harrison's brother. Tours liaison, Ensign Laura Dela Cruz, had greeted him with the gentle courtesy due a retired relative, then promptly lost track of him in the chaos. Now Eli squinted into the slate-colored squall, the salt spray cutting diagonally across his face. He tracked the wobbling nav lights in the clouds, as if mapping their drift on invisible graph paper. Around him, sailors shouted over the wind, "Sir, you need to move inside. This deck is red, sir." Eli didn't budge. Instead, in a voice calmer than the ship's anemometer, he called toward the yellow-shirted shooter bracing near the landing signal officer platform. "Those pilots are flying the wrong approach for this crosswind. Tell M2 offset 12 degrees port, and keep the ball 1 dot high. Otherwise, the roll vector'll slam them short." The shooter blinked rain from his lashes, half laughing. "With respect, sir, our LSO's got it." The laughter sounded thin, more nerves than mockery, but it was still dismissal. A gust ripped across the deck. The shooter dove for a cleat, and when he looked back, the old man was still standing there, measuring angles with his eyes. Independence's island superstructure loomed above them, its radar dishes spinning like frantic weather vanes. Inside Pryfly, the tower of the tower, Air Boss Wells pressed a headset closer, eyes dancing between a greenflow display and live feed from the Fresnel lens camera. The ball drifted, the lens swaying as the ship heaved. Everything about this recovery screamed no-go, but abandoning 5 strike fighters to ditch in a hurricane meant 5 ejection attempts into 30-foot seas. Odds like that lived somewhere below 0. Morales's voice snapped through again, tighter now. "Boss, Phoenix 2's down to 900 pounds. We're past Joker fuel." Wells swallowed. "Understood. Stand by." She killed the transmit and turned to Captain Rory Scott, CO of the Independence, who'd materialized behind her in soaked khakis. "Skipper, we might lose them." Before he could answer, a junior controller yelled, "Suggest traffic on alternate net." The auxiliary speaker crackled, and a baritone raspy, unmistakably unfazed filled the space. "Tower, this is Colonel Eli Harrison. You're running standard case 3, and it won't work. Your deck's rolling 8 degrees starboard, period 19 seconds. Adjust the glide slope, have them ride the upswing. I can walk them in." Wells frowned at Scott. "Colonel," but they had no time to vet calcins outside. Lightning flared white across the water. A Hornet silhouette flashed, plunged, right at itself. Morales called, "Mayday, mayday," losing horizon. Down on the flight deck, Eli Harrison stepped forward, rain streaming off his coat like dark wings. Under the clamor, he murmured to no one in particular, almost like reciting an old creed. "The storm owns the sky, but the ship owns the wave. Meet one with the other, and you bring your birds home." And for the first time that afternoon, a flicker of hope, thin as a filament, bright as the Fresnel lens, cut through the screaming dark. Inside Pryfly, the hurricane sounded like a freight train hammering sheet metal walls. Rain distorted the camera feed until the jet on screen looked like a ghost stitched out of static. Captain Scott kept one hand braced on the console, the other pressed to his headset. "Sir," Wells said, pointing to a waveform that trembled across her scope, "that's guest traffic from the flight deck net. Our colonel knows the exact roll period before we finish the math." Scott's jaw worked. He had 32 years in the Navy, had watched green ensigns grow into commodores, but he had never handed the ship's very soul to a civilian voice in a storm. Still, the numbers on the board were bleeding red. "Find out who the hell this man is," he said. Fast, down to ladders and a passageway lit by flickering red battle lanterns, Deck Chief Ramirez skidded into admin control. He slapped a soaked palm on a terminal access unit and keyed the manifest. "Harrison, Eli." The initial record was thin, dependent, emeritus guest. He drilled deeper and hit a blackhand gold advisory. "Restricted, level Omega clearance required." "Omega," Ramirez muttered. Only nuclear codes and buried Cold War prototypes carried Omega tags. He jabbed a request override. The system paused, then offered a single breadcrumb: Colaliakim J. Harrison, Asenret, former Carrier Qual flight test director, Project Whitecap. Ramirez stared. Whitecap was whispered grist from old chiefs, an experimental storm landing protocol so dicey it went straight to a vault. He spun on his heel and bolted back toward the flight deck. Up top, Eli Harrison had edged into the LSO platform itself, rainwater sluicing down gray hair plastered to his collar. The junior LSO, Ensign Mark Foley, gave a half-panicked glance toward Pryfly, but kept the mic open. Harrison's voice carried that unhurried gravel-soft authority that made younger men straighten unconsciously. "Balls drifting low because your lens is pitching opposite the deck. Dial in a 2-degree bias and tell your shooters to paint the centerline lights bright, not flashing. These kids are flying by electricity now, not eyeballs." Foley hesitated, then did it. The Fresnel lens brightened, its amber glow cutting a narrow corridor through horizontal rain. A klaxon sounded bingo fuel. Phoenix 3 was down to 700 pounds. Morales's voice returned, edged with fear he was too professional to let break. "Tower, Phoenix flight requests final guidance or we're punching." Harrison took the handset Foley offered, thumbed transmit. Phoenix led. "This is Colonel Harrison. I'm a voice you don't know, but I've brought birds home through worse." "Acknowledge the beat." Then Morales, "Copy, Colonel. Standing by." His reply sounded like a man grabbing the last rung of a ladder. Harrison spoke in rhythms pilots understood. No wasted syllables. "Deck roll 8 degrees. Starboard. Period. 19 seconds. You'll intercept on the upswing. Set IOA indexer 2 degrees high. Lead. Start downwind at 210 knots. Interval 15 seconds between jets. Maintain 600 feet. Visibility will drop to none at 3/4 mile. Fly instruments only. Call ball on my mark." Up in Pryfly, Wells watched the data refresh. Somehow the old man's figures matched theirs to the decimal. The captain's gaze flicked between her and the glass where the angry sea vaulted over the bow. Wells exhaled. "Sir, if we stall another minute, they'll be swimming." Scott slammed a gloved fist onto the railing, decision crystallizing like ice. "Patch him through primary." He hit the override, so Harrison's channel blared across every cockpit and every control station. "Pryfly today, call stations, execute Colonel Harrison's Whitecap parameters. This is not a drill." The announcement rippled outward like shockwaves. In the ready room, junior pilots watching telemetry jolted upright. On the hangar deck, ordnancemen paused mid-strap, mouthing Whitecap. And on the rain-glossed flight deck, Eli steadied himself, one hand on the cold steel stanchion, eyes fixed on the featureless gray horizon. He could feel the carrier's heartbeat now, the ponderous heave beneath deck plating, the timing of swell against keel. 40 years melted away. He He was back in a cockpit, Typhoon Karen, clawing at the Gulf of Tonkin, sweat pooling under a for helmet, and a younger voice on the radio begging for numbers that didn't yet exist. An overhead speaker cracked Phoenix-led Abium, 600 feet, commencing turn. Harrison's tone dropped to a low metronome. Roger, lead. Your high butt on profile. Deck, coming starboard. 3, 2, 1. Roll wings level. Begin descent. Power back point 1. Hold that meatball, she look low. Trust my call. Good Phoenix 2. Follow inside Pryfly. No one breathed. The lens camera tracked a faint green oval drifting inside rain static. The carrier pitched up. The oval centered. Harrison lead. You're on the uphill. Commit throttle idle rear. 5 feet height any correction. NOW sector. A thunderous shriek echoed as arresting gear took load. The first Super Hornet slammed down, hook biting cable 3. Flight deck cameras flashed white in the rain. Cheering erupted in catwalks, and 1 down, 4 to go. But Phoenix 2's voice cut in, crackling with cascade hail. Colonel Crosswind just spiked. I'm drifting left of centerline. Harrison's answer was iron-wrapped in calm. Ride it. Tap right rudder. Half stick into the wind. You're surfing the swell, not fighting it. Deck's about to flatten, trust the upswing. Mark, high above. Bolts of lightning spidered across cloud bellies, illuminating a solitary jet rolling wings level into blackness. Deck crews watched, breath misting, as a second shriek tore across the storm. The cable caught Phoenix 2 safe. 2 landings bought the Independence precious seconds, yet fuel counters kept spinning toward 0. Harrison's voice carried on, each command precise, each correction a chisel tapping chaos into shape. Somewhere inside the island, Captain Scott finally exhaled the breath he'd held since Morales's first call. But the storm was still climbing toward its peak, and 3 more jets waited their turn at the impossible dot. In the roar of wind, Eli Harrison adjusted his grip on the stanchion. Bring em home, boys, he whispered to the rain. The carrier's deck bucked like a wounded animal. Rain punched sideways, biting into metal and flesh. Crew members huddled behind blast deflectors, eyes locked on the sky, ears straining for the shriek of engines over the storm. Somewhere out in that furious gray, Phoenix 3, fuel lights screaming, made her final approach. Colonel, I've got crosshair, and chop everything's bouncing, the pilot said, panting through the cum dot. Eli Harrison didn't flinch. His left hand traced the rhythm of the carrier's roll against the metal platform beneath his boots. His voice was low, grounded, somehow cutting through the howl like a knife. You're feeling the wave on top of wind shear. You'll never fight both. Let one carry you. Use the roll. Pitch up 1 point. Quarter rudder into the gust. Wait for the swell to meet you. In the cockpit, Phoenix 3's pilot grit his teeth. Visibility was gone, just soup and vapor and wet static on the HUD. He blinked twice to clear the blur from his helmet visor. Harrison's voice came again. Throttle steady. Don't chase the deck. Let her come to you. You're in the trough stand. By 3, 2, 1, up. Pitch now. Catch it. A half-second later, the gear slammed onto the deck. The hook screamed across steel and held. A third wire catch. Cheers erupted across the flight deck again, but this time more frantic disbelieving. One sailor dropped to his knees and punched the air. Another whispered, "That's impossible. That's not supposed to happen. Not in this." Inside Combat Information Center, Commander Tessa NG, the ship's tactical officer, stared at the plotting screen and muttered, "Whitecap, that can't be real. That was shut down in '89. Captain Scott stood behind her, soaked sleeves rolled up, eyes distant. "She just landed 3 jets, he said quietly. "So either ghosts are flying them or the old man is exactly who he says he is." Across from them, the comms officer jumped in. "Sir, I've got a flash code from Pearl Harbor. SecNav, verification inbound. Background check confirms. Colonel Eliakim Joseph Harrison, retired, former test pilot, Project Whitecap lead. 3 distinguished flying crosses. Last active record, 1987. Scott didn't blink. Then he never stopped flying. Just changed cockpits. Back on deck, Phoenix 4 was inbound. "Colonel, this is 4. I've got partial HUD failure, and my gyros are lagging." "Copy that. 4, we're going to go full gut. You're flying by motion and muscle now. Do not look outside. Feel your descent. I've got the deck timing." Eli leaned forward, rain running down his nose, eyes scanning the sea. He saw it. The carrier dipped, held, now climbed again. 4. Adjust one click. Trim nose down. Begin your flare in 5, 4. Easy on the stick, there she is. Slam. The fourth fighter punched the deck so hard the gear flexed violently, but the hook caught wire 2 with a whip crack. Safely down. The deck crew lost it, even the hardened chiefs. Applause burst out, wet and hoarse and soaked in awe. 1 jet remained. Phoenix 5, the youngest pilot in the squadron. His voice came through shaking, barely composed. Colonel, I'm Bingo. Final run. This is it. Harrison's eyes didn't move from the sky. We're bringing you home, son. One ride, one wave. This is the one they'll remember. He closed his eyes for a beat, timing the roll. On my count, you go full commit. Do not hesitate. Let go of the math, just trust the call. You're on the deck's heartbeat now. 3, 2, 1. Dive. A blur broke through the clouds. Phoenix 5 sliced through the mist, hurtling toward the ocean like a stone thrown from Olympus. The entire deck team held their breath. The LSO braced. Against the rail, mouth frozen mid-command, Eli's voice. Now flare. Now let her catch you. With a thunderclap and a wrenching grind of metal on steel, the fifth and final Hornet slammed the deck. The hook skipped wire 1, then 2, then grabbed the 3-wire with a jolt so violent it rattled the flight deck cameras, and just like that, all 5 aircraft were down. The silence afterward was unreal. The only sound was the wind moaning through the superstructure and the distant howl of the storm like it. 2 had just realized it had lost. Captain Scott arrived at the flight deck personally, boots splashing through 2 inches of standing water. The deck crew parted for him without a word. He stepped onto the LSO platform, where Eli Harrison now leaned back, breathing hard but steady. Scott stared at him. You just landed 5 combat aircraft in a hurricane, he said, using a method the Navy classified out of fear. Eli shrugged, water dripping from his eyebrows. Fear's a funny thing. You can let it freeze you or you can learn to dance with it. The captain nodded slowly, then saluted. You just saved 5 of my pilots. Colonel, that doesn't happen every day. Eli returned the salute. No, Captain, but it should. And above them, the storm continued to rage, but the Independence had found its center again, because the man who once taught it how to stand in chaos had done it once more. By the time the last jet was secured to the deck and the crew began lashing down gear for the next wave of the storm, word of what had just happened had already surged through the ship like a shockwave. In the ready room, where young pilots still gripped coffee cups with trembling hands, someone whispered, "Did you hear who that was? Colonel Hawk Harrison." The Hawk, the white-cap guy, one of them, Lieutenant Nash. Phoenix 5 stared at the steam rising from his untouched drink and muttered, "He talked me down like he was in the cockpit with me. I didn't land that jet. He did." In Pryfly, Captain Scott stood beneath the low ceiling, hands behind his back, watching the rain shear off the armored glass. The comms officer returned, holding a folder marked Top Secret, eyes only with the trembling reverence usually reserved for nuclear protocols. "Sir," he said, "this just came through from Kamnov. It's about Harrison." Scott took it slowly. The file was thin, but what it lacked in bulk, it made up for in impact. He flipped pages in silence. Carrier qualified in '68, test pilot on every major. Storm deck simulation program between '71 and '86. Final mission: Typhoon Julia, 1984. 6 recoveries, 4 rescues, 1 lost wingman. Program shelved. Files sealed. In the margin, a handwritten note, considered too dangerous for implementation. Unofficial Navy recommendation: never forget the name Harrison. Scott read that last line twice. "Get me Admiral Mason," he said. 30 minutes later, through horizontal rain and typhoon crosswinds that grounded every drone in the fleet, a dark green MH-60S Nighthawk appeared in the distance, bucking like a wild horse through the gale. It circled wide, then came in low. The deck team, already soaked to the bone, formed up in a cautious semicircle. No one knew what was happening, only that it was big. The chopper kissed the deck with precision. The door slid open. A tall, iron-straight figure stepped out, cloak snapping in the wind. Admiral Raymond Mason, Pacific Fleet Commander. No warning, no entourage. He marched across the flight deck, boots thudding through water, his hat tucked under one arm to shield it from the wind. He moved straight toward the LSO platform. where Eli Harrison still stood, just a man with a cane, coat flapping, eyes on the storm. 20 feet away. The admiral stopped. He squared his shoulders. Then, without hesitation, he brought his heels together and saluted, crisp and sharp, as if before a fobster. "Colonel Harrison," he said, voice rising over the wind. "Permission to come aboard and pay my respects, sir." Eli looked up. For the first time, the storm in his eyes softened. "Granted, Admiral, though I'd be just as happy with a cup of black coffee and a chair that doesn't shift under my backside." A laugh rippled through the soaked deck crew. But Mason wasn't finished. He turned to the assembled sailors, now gathering in quiet awe, letting his voice carry across the ship. "Listen up. You've just witnessed something that hasn't happened in 40 years. The man standing before you didn't just land jets in a typhoon. He wrote the book on how to do it. And then the Navy locked that book away because it was too dangerous. And yet, when the time came, when it was either 5 good men lost to the sea or 1 man standing tall, he brought them home." The admiral turned back to Eli. "You taught half of us how to fly. The other half grew up reading ghost stories about you. But today, they saw it." Eli shifted, clearly uncomfortable in the spotlight, but stood straighter nonetheless. "I didn't fly today," he said quietly. "Those boys did. All I did was remind them they could trust themselves, even when the sky lies to them." As the storm continued, battering the carrier, the admiral extended a hand. Eli took it, not ceremoniously, like to warriors meeting again after a long-forgotten war. "Come inside," Colonel Mason said. "You've earned a dry uniform, and I think it's time someone told your story officially." But Eli shook his head. "Stories aren't meant for medals, Admiral. They're meant to teach. And the only reason I'm still standing here today is because someone once taught me when everything goes sideways, you don't panic. You listen, you time the roll, and you land." Later that evening, in the wardroom lit by flickering emergency lights, the pilots from Phoenix Flight gathered round Eli Harrison as if around a campfire. He answered their questions, not with bluster, with care. He described how to read the ocean beneath a bouncing deck, how to trust the motion, not the math, and how fear, if treated right, could sharpen your instincts rather than cripple them. He told them, gently, that storm flying didn't begin in the cockpit, it began in your gut. And when one young aviator, barely 24, asked him, "Sir, how did you know exactly when to call the descent?" Eli just smiled. "Because the sea has a rhythm. The trick isn't controlling it, it's learning to hear it." Outside, Hurricane Charlotte still howled over the Pacific. But inside the USS Independence, a new legend had just anchored, and every soul aboard knew they'd witnessed something that would echo across naval aviation forever. In the early hours of the next morning, the storm began to loosen its grip. Rain still raked across the windows in long diagonal streaks, but the wind had dropped to under 50 knots, and the carrier had stopped its violent lunging. Inside a quiet, ready room near the bow, lit only by red overhead lights and the faint hum of emergency power, Colonel Eli Harrison sat alone by a small table. In front of him lay a weather-beaten notebook, the same one he'd used on deck, and a half-empty mug of black coffee that had gone cold hours ago. He didn't touch either. Instead, he sat with one leg crossed over the other, hands steepled under his chin, listening, not to voices, not to machines, to the ship, to the soft creak of the bulkheads, to the changing vibration of the hull beneath him, to the long, slow roll that marked a return to calm, because Eli Harrison didn't need radar to understand the state of things. The carrier was breathing again. That meant her people could do down in the hangar bay. Phoenix Flight was being celebrated with handshakes, slaps on the back, and a few long hugs that no one pretended weren't necessary. The 5 pilots, still damp, still around at each other like men who'd escaped something too big to name. Lieutenant Commander Gabe Morales, Phoenix led, stood slightly apart. He wasn't smiling, not quite. He kept replaying Italy's voice in his ears, calling out the timing, the rhythm, the unseen wave that somehow caught his plane and laid it down like a feather instead of letting the sea devour it. And Ensign approached. "Sir, word is Admiral Mason's requesting a commendation package for that old man. Full honors." Morales didn't even blink. "He doesn't need a medal." "What then?" Morales looked across the hangar, eyes landing on Eli Kane leaning against the bulkhead beside the wardroom door. "He needs to be remembered. That's what keeps the rest of us alive." Elsewhere on the ship, Admiral Mason stood in the captain's quarters with Captain Scott and Air Boss Wells. A single sheet of paper spread across the table between them. It was Eli's original Whitecap recovery protocol, written by hand, never digitized, never officially tested in full. Wells tapped one section with her pen. He wrote this part before we had computerized stabilization. How the hell did he even come up with these roll timing offsets? Scott answered without looking up, by being the only man crazy enough to land during the storm, and then calm enough to write it down. Mason exhaled slowly. I want this declassified. I want the tape of yesterday's landings included in training packages for every carrier pilot in the fleet. The next time somebody laughs at a retired officer on the deck, they better remember what that laugh cost us last time. He paused, then added, and when this man leaves the Independence, he leaves with an escort. Formal, dignified, full colors, no exceptions. That evening, Eli was invited to the officers' mess for dinner. He declined. Instead, he requested something else, to speak with the junior deck crew, the green shirts, the fresh hands, the young sailors who had nearly shoved him below deck hours earlier. They gathered in the enlisted galley, not knowing what to expect. No cameras, no speeches, just a man in an old uniform jacket, leaning on his cane, with a voice like slow thunder and a gaze that carried storms. He stood at the front of the room, then simply asked, "How many of you want to fly someday?" Half the hands went up. A few nodded. One whispered, "More than anything, sir." Eli smiled gently. "Good. Then let me tell you what flying actually means." And for the next 20 minutes, he told them everything that no simulator, no textbook, no digital overlay could ever capture. He told them about feeling the lift in your gut before your instruments confirm it, about how fear is just another form of data. You either use it or drown in it, about how the ocean doesn't care about your wingspan, your radar, your rank only, about your timing. And finally, he told them, one day, you'll be the one with 5 lives hanging on your next word. When that day comes, you won't remember what you were told. You'll remember what you felt. If you learn to listen to the storm, not fight it, you'll know when to speak, and more important, when not to. On the 4th morning, after the storm, the skies were clear. At 0700 hours, Colonel Eli Harrison stood at the edge of the flight deck, now dry, sunlit, and strangely quiet. A formation of sailors stood in dress whites. The ship's band, flown in via helicopter, played the Navy hymn, and as Eli stepped toward the waiting MH-60 that would take him back to land, every member of Phoenix Flight saluted in unison. So did Captain Scott, so did Air Boss Wells, so did every deckhand who had once rolled their eyes at a quiet old man in the wrong place at the wrong time, because now they knew he'd never been in the wrong place, and his time, though passed by the Navy clock, had never really ended. It just took a storm to remind them. And as the chopper lifted off, slicing into the blue sky where jets had once fought for their lives, the memory of that landing, of those landings, settled deep into the bones of the Independence. Not a tale of protocol, not a line in the flight log, but a story passed from sailor to sailor, officer to ensign, whispered on dark decks for decades to come. There was a man once who could hear the sea. Weeks passed. The USS Independence returned to port with quiet dignity, her decks scraped and her systems tested, but her reputation somehow larger than it had been before, not because of any battle fought, not because of any enemy defeated, but because of something far rarer in the modern Navia myth, reborn in real time. And the name on everyone's lips wasn't in the ship's chain of command. At a flight school in Pensacola, a young instructor stood in front of a classroom of newly minted lieutenants. "Today," she said, tapping the projection behind her, "we're going to study what happens when standard procedure fails, when the books go quiet and the sky goes black." On screen was grainy footage from the deck of the Independence. 5 Super Hornets landing in a hurricane. A hand rose. "Is this real, ma'am?" She smiled. "It's very real. Happened just last month." All 5 jets were guided down in a category for hurricane by a retired pilot who hadn't flown in decades. Another hand. Who was he? She turned to the class. Colonel Eliakim Harrison, but everyone just called him the Hawk. At the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, a quiet display appeared beside the famous Blue Angels exhibit. It was modest, a weathered cane, an oilskin flight log, and a set of hand-drawn storm recovery diagrams preserved behind glass. The plaque read, "Storm Whisperer, the Untold Legacy of Colonel Eli Harrison." in memory of the pilot who brought the sky home through silence, science, and instinct. The display became one of the museum's most visited exhibits, not because it was flashy, but because it felt like truth, like something you could carry into a cockpit. In Washington, a subcommittee reviewed the full declassified Whitecap report. What had once been considered too dangerous was now being adapted into next-gen storm recovery protocols. The irony wasn't lost on the Navy's senior brass. One rear admiral, reviewing the footage of Eli on the deck, said quietly, "He wasn't ahead of his time. We were just behind his." As for Eli himself, he never went on tour, never gave speeches, never appeared on camera. When a documentary team requested an interview, he politely declined with a note written in block capitals, "I'm not the story. The sea is." He returned to a quiet home tucked into the California coastline, in old clapboard house with wind chimes, a weather vane shaped like an F4 Phantom, and a porch facing the ocean. Every morning he'd sit there with black coffee, listening, not to podcasts, not to the news, to the pattern of the waves. And when the wind blew just right and the surf snapped against the cliffs, he would close his eyes and smile, not because he missed the storm, but because he understood it. And yet, far away, on ships he would never board again, in squadrons he would never command, his name endured. You'd hear it whispered in simulators. What would the Hawk call here? You'd hear it on midnight watches. Colonel Harrison would have read that swell an hour ago. And sometimes, when a young pilot lost horizon and had to bring a bird home blind, someone in the tower would murmur, "Don't worry, just time the roll and listen for the wave." That's what he did, because legends don't die. They just become part of the air we breathe, part of the sea we sail, part of the silence we trust when the storm blots everything else out. And somewhere beyond wind, beyond wire, beyond war, one man's voice still lingers, calm, steady, timeless. Throttle back, eyes forward, let the wave carry you in. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes experience matters. Subscribe for more untold legends that prove true courage never retires.